It was a rainy afternoon when I stumbled across it. A letter, tucked away at the bottom of an old postbag, almost as if it had been waiting for me. Its edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the name on the front was clear, Margaret. From the moment I found that dusty, yellowed envelope tucked away in the bottom of my old postbag, I knew it wasn't just any letter. The name scrawled across the front, Margaret, was fading, and the stamp hinted it had been sent decades ago. I had been a postman for years, but this was a mystery begging to be solved. I wondered, who was Margaret, and why had this letter been forgotten? Curiosity got the best of me. That evening, I gently opened the letter, careful not to tear its fragile paper. The words inside were raw and full of emotion. A man named Thomas had written it during the war. Margaret, not a moment passes that I don't think of you. You are my safe place, my hope in this madness. If I make it back, I promise we'll have the life we've always dreamed of. Yours forever, Thomas. It was more than just a letter. It was a promise. But why hadn't Margaret received it? Did Thomas come back? Did Margaret ever wait for him? The next day, I set out to find Margaret or anyone who knew her. The address on the envelope was for a house just a few blocks away. But when I got there, I found only an overgrown lot. A neighbor told me the house had been torn down years ago, and the family had moved away. I didn't give up. I searched through old directories, libraries, and even social media. After days of searching, I found a lead, a nursing home where an elderly Margaret lived. My heart raced as I decided to visit her. Margaret was sitting in a sunny corner of the common room, her silver hair neatly pinned up. When I introduced myself and explained about the letter, her eyes filled with tears. "Thomas," she whispered, clutching the letter. "I thought he'd forgotten me." She told me how she had waited for him after the war, but when he didn't return or write, she believed he had moved on, or worse, been killed. She had eventually married someone else, but her love for Thomas had never faded. Hearing her story made my heart ache, but something didn't add up. What had happened to Thomas? I decided to dig deeper. After days of searching, I discovered that Thomas had survived the war. He had returned to their town and tried to find Margaret, but she had already moved. He believed she had moved on and eventually started a new life himself. I tracked Thomas down, now living with his son in a nearby town. When I told him about the letter and Margaret, he broke down. "I loved her with everything I had," he said. The reunion was bittersweet. When Thomas arrived at the nursing home, Margaret was waiting in the same sunny corner. The moment their eyes met, it was as if time had melted away. "I thought I'd lost you," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "You never did," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. Their love, rekindled after all those years, blossomed like spring after a long winter. They began meeting regularly, sharing memories of their youth and dreams for the time they still had. One afternoon, as they sat in the nursing home's garden, Thomas turned to Margaret with a hopeful smile. "Margaret, we may have lost years, but we still have time. Would you let me spend the rest of it with you?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were happy ones. "Thomas, I've waited my whole life to hear you say that." "Yes, of course." Their families were overjoyed at the news. Despite their age, Margaret and Thomas had a small, intimate wedding surrounded by their children and grandchildren. The ceremony took place in the nursing home's garden, the very spot where Thomas had proposed. Margaret wore a simple but elegant white dress, and Thomas donned his old war medals on a sharp navy suit. As they exchanged vows, the guests were moved to tears. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a testament to love enduring the trials of time. The couple spent their remaining years cherishing each moment together. They became local legends, their story of lost and found love inspiring everyone who heard it. Thomas would read to Margaret every evening, often reciting poems about love and resilience. Margaret would joke that the letter he wrote her was the best poem of all. One day, while sitting together under a tree in the garden, Margaret looked at Thomas and said, "Even if I had to wait another lifetime, I'd do it all again." Thomas smiled, holding her hand tightly. "And I'd find my way back to you every time." Their story didn't just end with their passing. It became a legacy of hope. The nursing home even placed a plaque in the garden, dedicated to Margaret and Thomas, a love that waited but never faded. And so, their love became timeless, proving to everyone that it's never too late for a happy ending. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe for more interesting videos.